Hello, my name is Denise Cooper, and we at Nearform were sorry to see the Linux Foundation Member Summit cancellation. So we thought we'd record the talk that I was going to give and offer it to people who were enrolled to attend, just in case they were planning to come or looking forward to that session. So I hope that you enjoy this, and if you have any questions, the last slide will have my email address where you can reach me. Alrighty then, let's get going. So this talk is about the inevitability of InnerSource and how it will help sustain open source. So first of all, what is InnerSource? Well, Tim O'Reilly coined this term back in 2001. And he did it because he was on the board of a company called collab.net that was actually organized to teach InnerSource to companies. It was co-organized by Tim and Brian Bellendorf of the Apache Foundation. And they were not very successful at doing this in 2001. And we'll talk about why that happened a little bit later. But they were very committed to it. And the idea really stuck in my head. And later, when I found myself needing to come up with something to help a company that wanted to learn how to do open source, but was not doing a very good job of figuring it out, InnerSource sprung to mind. So that's where the term comes from. I spell it with one word in camel case because I was very popular back in the 2000s, but also it makes it easier to actually search for it and find something you're looking for. So please spell it that way, and let's move along. This bumblebee is here to remind us that bumblebees are not aerodynamic, and they're not actually meant to be able to fly with those tiny little wings and those big bodies. But miraculously they do, and they are, major pollinators. Similarly, open source was not really meant to fly. It was a hobby pursuit of engineers who were interested in improving their access to the code that they depended on. Products like Office and Windows used to drive us nuts because they had all these bugs, and the company would take their time to fix them. And because the products didn't ship with source code, we couldn't just fix them ourselves and recompile. So we started this impossible movement, if you can imagine, to completely recreate the world of computing, but in a way that the code is always open. And it was very unlikely to succeed, which turned out to be one of the reasons that it did, because major companies that could have sought to kill it didn't bother because they didn't think they were going to have to. So starting about 15 years ago, I would say we actually won in the market. I think the moment that we won is probably when Microsoft finally capitulated and agreed to become a good contributor, or sought to become a good contributor. But this is handy because now people who are thinking about going into the InnerSource realm are more confident than they were back in 2001 that open source methods really are able to produce higher quality software faster. And so there's an awful lot of companies now that are really interested in learning about this. So let's look at why open source won a little bit more closely. It was so easy for the major competitors to open source to laugh about the likelihood that, say, Linux was ever going to beat Solaris. The Sun folks didn't think that was possible for a long time, or that, in fact, any piece of software, Apache was going to own the web. There were lots and lots and lots of things that came out of the open source movement, but we didn't know that we were going to win until big companies started showing up with real contributions and real commitment and also resources. And so, it turns out that those companies figured out that they don't each have to implement the same horizontal software. The whole industry can grow faster and better if everybody relies on the same pieces of horizontal software and differentiates on the verticals. And that's kind of what open source has allowed. There isn't a company that's been founded since 2000 that didn't rely heavily on the existence of open source. But unfortunately, even after all that progress, it's still the case that about 85% of engineers worldwide are stuck in the salt mines. They're still working in an old-fashioned way. And that's because of history. It's because change is hard. It's because corporations are complex cultures. But more and more, there are companies that are interested in making those shifts. And they pretty much have to do it because the idea that you could hire more and more engineers and be more and more productive has been pretty much debunked. Getting the engineers that you hire to be the highest quality and at the same time as productive as they can be is currently of great interest. And continuing to be flexible enough as a company to be able to actually innovate or outmaneuver your competition is also something that people are trying to learn how to do again. But the reality is they're stuck with silos. Silos happen when you allow over-specialization within a company, in the engineering organization, so that a very few people are the only ones that understand how key pieces of the software work. And there's very little cross-company knowledge. This, of course, engenders bottlenecks, which are like traffic jams in your system, where too many people are making requests of the same small number of experts, and there's no way that they can fulfill them in the timeframes that are needed. And as companies accelerate their ability to integrate and deploy, because that's what all the cool kids are doing, they put even more stress on those silos to figure out how to do a better job of helping the rest of the company understand how to work within their code constraints. The other thing that is driving the interest in InnerSource, however, is lack of innovation in companies where there's such a well-oiled machine that they keep reproducing the same successful movements over and over again, and they never actually think outside of the very tightly controlled box that they're in. And that's another danger for big and old companies, that they're going to get stuck in the way that they've been working. But there are companies that have shown that InnerSource is effective at breaking up this particular problem. We'll talk about that a little bit more. And then another reason that companies are interested in InnerSource is because the new workforce, people that they can hire at the low end of the compensation spectrum, so beginning engineers fresh out of college, they have grown up with with open source as an expectation. They expect transparency, they expect collaboration, they expect all of these things that most companies still don't do. And companies that do a lot of hiring and interning with younger engineers find that they're not very happy when they learn about the reality of how this work is accomplished, and they don't feel empowered and they don't feel like they want to stay in those companies. So keeping the workforce both engaged and excited is a real reason to consider changing the way that the engineers work. And another thing that we're seeing is companies going out and buying GitHub Enterprise licenses, hoping for the whole internet effect. But unfortunately, GitHub alone will not get you there. And even GitHub knows that. There's a lot of subtleties of things that you need to learn to turn a company from a siloed community into a collaborative community. And just changing the tooling will not do that. In my experience, a lot of companies that go get GitHub Enterprise then proceed to, limit people's access to different parts of the total code base, basically mirroring however things were set up before they got GitHub Enterprise. Because again, change is hard, and people are concerned that those controls are in place for good reason, and they don't want to undermine security or whatever reason they imagine that happened for. GitHub's a great tool. We're always happy when we run into it in our consulting practice, but it's not by itself the whole answer. So this is the InnerSource logo. I started talking about InnerSource in 2015 publicly because when I looked at PayPal's inability to build vibrant open source communities based on their products and things that they wanted to open source, I realized that the problem that they had was that they had no practice of collaboration inside the company, and it was actually kind of a foreign idea. And so I figured that if we did a little bit of InnerSource, 2-3 years of it, that we would emerge as better candidates to collaborate in open source space. And so that's why I undertook it. They wanted to develop full stack knowledge through direct collaboration, and they wanted to unstick their bottlenecks in some key silos. So that was their original goal. This is a logo, a piece of artwork from Bosch that I stole. Bosch has been very, very active in the community that we're building around InnerSource. And I'll talk more about the community in a little bit on another slide. But what this is showing you is all the parts of the company that have achieved cross-platform collaboration just in the last 8 years of them practicing InnerSource. They did it because they were trying to stimulate more innovation. So they were stuck in certain ways of doing work that were keeping them from thinking outside the box. So they decided that adopting open source methods might change things up, but they found a lot of other benefits at the same time. And they were able to quantify the level of interconnectedness that they have now and cross-company understanding that's really, really helped them develop some new products that they never would have been able to get to before. So there's proof that at least one very large, very old engineering organization could achieve this change. We're seeing an awful lot of companies that are attracted to Agile, the ideas of Agile and Scrum, as a way to change things up. This is obviously an Agile Scrum, first thing in the morning stand-up meeting here. And I can only presume that the guy with the chicken head is the Scrum Master. People ask us sometimes if InnerSource and Agile can coexist, and the truth is they coexist beautifully. Agile is a very good tool for organizing the work of engineers. In my experience, most large companies don't actually practice Agile, they practice Wagile, because giving engineers the ability to actually determine what should be built is a step too far for most large old companies. They want to still have central planning and central advice about which features are most important and those kinds of things. But they like the idea of organizing teams into 2-week sprints, which is super helpful because you get a regular periodicity of release habit, which you can then use to figure out if your InnerSource is working. And you're achieving the goals you're looking for. The only advice out of the Agile camp that doesn't work for InnerSource is the advice that all teams should be physically co-located. I understand why they're recommending it. If you're trying to somehow reproduce the startup effect, I guess that would make sense because startups tend to be co-located, although not all of them. But it's really bad for InnerSource if everybody's in the same room because it reduces the need to write down your advice to your colleague. And if all advice is delivered verbally, the two people who share that conversation have both learned something, but nobody else will learn anything from that conversation unless it is somehow memorialized. So we prefer to try to push for written advice, at least from the trusted committers to contributors in the InnerSource circle. All right. We also get a lot of questions about whether InnerSource is compatible with continuous integration and delivery efforts. And we find that it's incredibly compatible. In fact, it's kind of a marriage made in heaven. The reason is that most companies that are trying to achieve CI/CD are trying to do it from greenfield. They don't have anything now. And that gives them an opportunity to try to build one solution for the whole company instead of having one for every division or one for every work group in some cases, which is sort of defeats the purpose of continuous integration and delivery if everybody's doing it a little bit differently and there's no sort of economies of scale achievable. So what we find is that companies that are thinking about integrating and delivering continuously are very happy to use that as their first InnerSource project so that they can get everybody on board, and do a lot of code reuse, at least in this one area. So that's good news for DevOps folks. And I get asked to speak at DevOps conferences quite often. This is a picture of the dashboard of InnerSource Commons. And I promise that I'm getting in a minute to the how it's going to help FOSS, although you've heard a little bit of it already, but I want to be sure and get all the material about what InnerSource is in your minds first. So InnerSource Commons is a website that I started shortly after, in fact, on the same day, that I realized PayPal really could use InnerSource as a stepping stone to open source. I decided that there were probably many companies that were in the same boat. And so we set up InnerSourceCommons.org and announced it at the first OSCON keynote where we talked about InnerSource. And we almost immediately had 300 people show up wanting to have conversations about InnerSource from some of the biggest tech companies that you can think of, because it was on everybody's lips. And it wasn't just because I said it, it was everybody had the idea at the same time that maybe if open source was so successful, it could help them internally. But people didn't know how to talk about it. There wasn't any common practice. So we created this foundation, and it's recently been stood up as a standalone foundation that I'm the president of, that is also going to become a California nonprofit, hopefully. The idea there is that we are sharing, we 350, I think it's actually higher now, the number, people that are interested in making InnerSource real inside companies. We're sharing both our successes and our failures fairly openly to try to fail faster and everybody get to the great leap forward, faster. Because again, this is not an individual company's competitive advantage. This is an industry competitive advantage. If you don't learn how to do this, you'll be behind. But if you do learn how to do it, you'll be in good company. InnerSource Commons is run on something called Chatham House rules, which means that you can safely ask a question, any question, without fear that you're risking your brand because the question is too naive. We have agreed as a community to never use social media to shame a company based on the kinds of questions or practices that they're engaging in. So it's a safe place to come. It's free to join. You get a Slack account and you're in. You can find lots of work that's going on in this community. And it's an all volunteer community. It's run kind of like Apache because InnerSource is a lot like Apache. So we run a lot like the ESF. Anyway, check it out. And there are a number of publications that have been produced for InnerSource so far. These three are ones I was involved in. The one on the left, Getting Started, is the most downloaded non-code asset on GitHub right now. And it is a 26-page executive summary of what a first experiment looked like at PayPal, with one of the most important pieces of software that PayPal has authored, and why they undertook the experiment and what they found in terms of positive outcomes. It doesn't talk about the whole experiment because it was still in play when we actually did the book. So the end of that experiment is discussed in the pink book, which is on the right. That's the most recent book that I co-wrote with Klaus-Jan Stoll, a professor at University of Limerick when we wrote the book, but now he's at University College Cork. He had written a number of papers, research papers on InnerSource, but nobody was reading them because they were academic. So this made it an O'Reilly book, and people are finding it very accessible. The book has his theories as an introduction chapter. Then there's 6 stories from companies with an intention of having you understand what you could do in your company by looking at what other companies have done. And maybe you'll recognize your problem in there somewhere. And then at the end, there is a whole chapter of practical advice about what to do next. Now, there are other books coming, but this is what we have now. The middle book, Understanding the InnerSource Checklist, is one that I've been working with quite a lot lately. My colleague at PayPal, Salona Bonewald, was the authoress. She is a person who thinks in terms of checklists, and so she had created quite a large checklist, and we decided to decorate it with some explanations and get it in print so people could start using it. And I am mining from it for a series of questionnaires that people can answer to help speed up cultural inventory. There's also books written not by me or with my involvement. This is a booklet that you can download off the InnerSource Commons website. Those other books are available off the O'Reilly website and also off of InnerSource Commons. This book is meant to be self-printed, and it is a monograph from Bitergia, our friends. They were academics who were interested in metrics. They're all quants, and they started building a platform for measuring open source metrics. And they got interested in the problem space of measuring for companies when they are doing experiments in InnerSource. So that's a super useful guide, and they're a good company to contact if you're trying to work out your metrics situation. We work with them often at Nearform. Then we do have in-person meetings, and we have one planned for mid-April in Spain. Now, given what's going on with conferences right now, I think it's likely that this will be a virtual conference rather than a conference that people physically show up to. But we haven't actually made that call yet, so I don't want to preempt the conference team if they've figured out a better way to do it in person. But the next one is advertised on the InnerSource Commons website. It is this meeting in Madrid. And we are committed to recording all the sessions and making them available, even if the event doesn't go forward. But those are good events to go to in person if you get a chance. They're very inexpensive to attend, and you learn a ton. And that's also where we get together for the governance of the InnerSource Commons. It is also the case that there are several tutorials available. O'Reilly has a series of tutorials in their Learning Path collection that are about InnerSource. They were produced by the InnerSource Commons community and paid for by PayPal. There's also an InnerSource Day at OSCON most years, have been for several years running now, where we get 50 to 75 people in a room, and they spend the whole day listening to presentations from companies that have been seeing interesting outcomes from their own InnerSource experiments. And we do a little bit of a tutorial, and everybody gets to meet up. So if InnerSource happens in July, we're hopeful that that will happen again. And then the company that I work for, Nearform, also has bespoke tutorials that they offer, along with a full line of consulting products around your InnerSource journey that you can arrange to have my direct assistance on. If that's something that's interesting to you, there's more information about how to contact me at the end of this talk. Okay, so that is everything that you need to know about what InnerSource is and how you can get involved. This is my personal InnerSource logo that my colleague Cedric Williams made for me, because I'm, an old hippie, and I want to see InnerSource bloom like this. But I want to talk about the inevitability question for a minute now. So I believe that InnerSource is inevitable because open source has been so successful. And if you look at what's happening around the world right now, where companies are having to pull their teams remote in order to deal with the current crisis that we're seeing that canceled the event where this talk was supposed to be given, you'll see that teams are now working remotely. They're working asynchronously, and they're going to have to figure out how to collaborate. That's just, companies are going to have to figure out how to do this, if only to get full resource utilization, but also for all the other reasons that we named before, for the happiness of their younger employees, frankly, some of their older employees as well, for cross-company knowledge, to be able to figure out how to modularize or microservicize their existing silos. For lots of reasons, this is going to happen. How is it going to help open source? Well, after a few years of learning InnerSource, PayPal started proposing open source projects that were actually going to be useful and that people were going to want to do, that were going to be popular out in the world. And once they launched them, they knew how to collaborate with the people that didn't work for PayPal that came to work on those projects. There was recently a talk given at FOSDEM by Bradley Kuhn about the dangers of InnerSource. Bradley's afraid that InnerSource is going to hurt open source because people are going to be happier working in companies than they will be out in the wild. But I don't think that's actually true. I think that engineers in companies are actually quite hungry to work publicly, but the companies themselves are so concerned about making a bad showing and damaging their brand or wasting time that they're anxious to learn collaboration in a safe internal environment and fix some of their engineering woes before they try to go public. So I believe that we will see a lot more open source as a result of InnerSource, and that's why I undertook it in the first place. But also, sustainability is going to require huge growth. This, by the way, is Thap Prom in Cambodia, and it's famously being eaten by its trees. Right, so open source is kind of like this. We're eating the industry, as Mark Andreessen has said famously, but we're also kind of tearing it apart in the process of relying on a small number of people, relatively small number of people that know how to work in this environment. The more people that we can bring in and turn into practitioners, the better. And if they start inside of companies first and then branch out for their own reasons or because their companies want them to, we automatically get more people we can hire who already know how to do open source, already know how to collaborate, are not afraid to become contributors, are not afraid to have their code reviewed, and are thankful for the quality boost that you get from many eyes. There are so many good reasons to move to this in this direction. And it will be so helpful for open source once this engine gets going. I mean, we're seeing it now. We're seeing companies that are starting out in open source and heading to InnerSource, and we're seeing companies that are starting out in InnerSource and heading to open source. And I think there's nothing wrong with that bilateral evolution of engineering, which was the whole point in the first place. So that is about the end of my talk. This slide shows you how you find out how to get a copy of the Pink Book sent to you from my company. We ship them all over the world. We're very happy to do that. It also has my email address if you have any questions after watching this. And I hope that you will consider going over to InnerSource Commons at a minimum and getting involved, or at least poking your nose in the door to see what's up there and how we're going to move forward. And thank you very much for your time. I hope that you're having a good time wherever you're holed up, and as am I here in Ireland. And I hope we get to see each other soon in human space again. All right, take care now. Bye-bye.